He had done this before, sat in a place where he did not belong, wearing clothes that cost less than what he spent on a single meal in his own life, and waited to see what happened. It was not a complicated test. It did not require preparation beyond the clothes and the decision not to arrive in the car he usually arrived in. It required only patience, which Cillian Voss had in quantities that most people found unsettling, and the specific kind of attention that came from years of needing to know, accurately and quickly, what kind of person was in front of him and what they would do when circumstances were other than they appeared. He had learned, over a long time, that the most reliable information about a person was not what they did when they knew they were being watched. It was what they did when they thought they were not. The diner on Diversey was not the reason he was in Logan Square that morning. The reason was a man named Fenwick, who worked in his supply chain and who had been, according to Rook's most recent report, having breakfast twice a week at this specific location with a person whose identity Rook had not yet confirmed. Cillian had come to look at the room, at the configuration of the space, at who could see what from where. He had not come to sit down. He sat down. The booth by the window had a clear sightline to the door and to the counter and to the table in the far left corner, where Fenwick would presumably be sitting on Thursday mornings. According to the pattern Rook had documented, the booth was available. Cillian sat in it and picked up the laminated menu and looked at it without reading it, and looked, over the top of it, at the room. The diner was the kind of place that had been in continuous operation for long enough that it had arrived at a state of equilibrium between its original design and the accumulated evidence of everything that had happened to it since. The counter stools were mismatched in a way that was clearly the result of replacement rather than intention. The booths were the deep red of vinyl that had been cleaned so many times the cleaning had become the color. The coffee machine behind the counter was both very old and extremely competent, which Cillian noted because he had learned to pay attention to coffee machines as early indicators of how a kitchen was run. He was still looking at the menu when someone arrived at the side of his booth and said, without preamble, "Coffee." He looked up. Nini Osei was 31 years old and had been working this floor for 6 years and had developed, in that time, the specific economy of motion that came from doing a thing well for long enough that the doing became efficient rather than effortful. She moved through the diner the way water moved through known territory, not quickly, exactly, but without friction, without the small hesitations and recalibrations of someone still learning the space. She was carrying a coffee pot in her right hand and had a notepad in her apron pocket and was looking at him with the expression of a person who had assessed the situation and was waiting for a response to a reasonable question. "Please," he said. She poured. She did it correctly, which was to say she poured it to within half an inch of the top of the cup and stopped, which was the correct amount and also the amount that demonstrated she had poured coffee into a cup enough times to know where to stop without thinking about it. "Menu," she said. "I have one," he said. "Take your time," she said, and moved to the next table. He looked at the menu. He made the decision he had been half-making since he sat down. He would order the cheapest items and see what happened. It was not his usual reason for being here, and it was not what Rook would have expected him to be doing. But he was here, and the booth was comfortable, and the coffee was already very good, and the decision had a kind of low-stakes interest to it that he was not going to examine too carefully. He ordered when she came back. Eggs, scrambled, the smallest size, toast, white, 1 slice, coffee, which he already had. The total of these items, he had already calculated from the menu, was $4.75 before tax, which was less than he spent on coffee in a normal morning, and which was not the point, but which he noted. She wrote it down without comment. She did not look at the items in a way that suggested she was comparing them to what he had ordered or to what other people ordered. She wrote them down and tore the ticket from the notepad and went to the counter and put the ticket in the wheel and called the order to the kitchen. Cillian drank his coffee and watched the room. In the 22 minutes between when he ordered and when the food arrived, He observed the following: Nini Osei covered 4 tables and the counter simultaneously, which was a surface area that required a specific kind of spatial management to do without visible effort. She managed it without visible effort. She refilled coffee for 3 people without being asked, which meant she had been tracking cup levels across the room while doing other things. She had a brief exchange with a man at the counter that ended with him laughing, though Cillian was too far away to hear the content. She dropped a fork, picked it up, replaced it with a clean one from her apron pocket, before the customer at that table had finished registering that the fork had fallen. She brought his food at the 22-minute mark. She set the plate in front of him with the eggs at 12 o'clock and the toast at 6, which was the most space-efficient configuration for a single diner eating alone, which was not something most servers thought about explicitly, but which Nini Osei appeared to have incorporated into the way she set plates down. Anything else, she said. No. He said, thank you. She left. He ate. The eggs were correct scrambled, but not overworked. The specific texture that came from removing them from the heat at the right moment, which was a small thing, and which told him the kitchen paid attention. The toast was adequately toasted. The coffee, when she refilled it at the 30-minute mark, without being asked, was still at the temperature it should be at. He ate and watched the room and thought about Fenwick and the unidentified breakfast companion and the configuration of the space, which was more open than he would have liked from a surveillance standpoint, but which had 2 exits and a clear counter sightline that would be useful for what Rook needed to document. He was thinking about this when he reached for the check holder and remembered he did not have cash. This was true, and also the point he had left his wallet at home, his real wallet, with the cards, and the Kashand had brought only a $20 bill, which was the amount of cash a person who was slightly short on money for the week might plausibly have. And the check was $22 and change with tax, and he was, as planned, $2 short. He had done this before, the last time. It had been a restaurant in Wicker Park, and a manager he was considering promoting, and the manager had looked at the amount and at him, and had done the specific calculation of cost-benefit that people did when they thought they were not being observed, and had said, in the voice of someone doing a favor that was actually a judgment, "That's fine. We'll comp the difference this time." The time before that it had been a woman he was considering a long-term arrangement with, and she had looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating the resources available to them and had offered to cover it, which had told him what he needed to know. He picked up the check and looked at it, and then looked up and found Nini already at the end of the counter, as though she had noticed the specific quality of stillness that came from a person who had picked up a check and was not immediately putting it down. She came over. "Problem," she said. "I'm short," he said. He said it without performance, just the information, delivered plainly. "I have 20, and the check is $22.40. I have my card, but it's he." Paused. "It's a bad week." He waited. He had learned that the wait was the test. What came in the first 2 seconds of a person receiving this information was more reliable than anything they said after they had decided what to say. Nini looked at the check. She looked at him. She did not do the specific calculation he had seen before. She did not produce the careful sympathy or the brisk efficiency of someone doing a favor or the subtle recalibration of someone reassessing. She looked at the check and she looked at him and she said, "Don't worry about it." She took the check from him. She went to the register. She did something with the touchscreen that he could see from the booth involved several taps in the sequence of someone navigating a POS system with the fluency of a person who had been using it for 6 years. She put the 20 he had left on the table in the drawer. She did not bring change. She went to the table behind him and took their order. She did not look at him again. Not the pointed, not looking of someone who had done something and was managing their awareness of having done it. Just the ordinary not looking of a person who had moved on to the next thing because the previous thing was finished. Cillian sat in the booth for another few minutes. He picked up the coffee cup and found it had been refilled at some point during the transaction, which he had not noticed happening. which meant she had refilled it while he was looking at the check, in the same motion as coming to the table, without interrupting either action. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the room. He looked at Nini Osei, who was now at the far end of the counter explaining something to the man who had laughed earlier, her back to him. Entirely occupied with whatever that conversation was, he had run this test before. He had been running it, in various forms, for 15 years. He knew what the results looked like. He knew the shape of the responses, the generosity that was performance, the coldness that was honesty, the warmth that was calculation, and he had become, over 15 years of running it, very accurate at reading which was which. He did not know what to do with this result. He left the diner. He walked to the car, which was parked 2 blocks away, which was the distance he always parked when he did not want to be connected to an arrival. He sat in the car for a moment and thought about the specific way Nini Osei had looked at the check and then at him, in the 2 seconds before she had said, "Don't worry about it," and what that look had contained, which was neither sympathy nor calculation nor performance, nor the particular quality he had learned to identify as goodness being deployed, which was different from goodness. He could not place it. He started the car and drove back toward the city and thought about it for most of the drive, and by the time he arrived at his office, he had reached the conclusion that he needed more information, which was a conclusion he reached often and which usually produced a call to Rook. He called Rook, the waitress at the Diversi diner. He said, "Nini Osei, I want a background check." A pause. The waitress. Rook said, in the tone he used when he was registering something unexpected and filing it without comment. The waitress. Cillian confirmed. Timeline. Today. He ended the call. He sat at his desk and looked at the window and thought about a coffee cup refilled in the same motion as coming to deliver news, without interrupting either action, and thought about what it meant that the most information-rich moment in the past 15 years of running a particular test had been the 2 seconds when someone had simply looked at him and said, "Don't worry about it," and meant it in a way he could not categorize. Rook's background check on Nini Osei arrived in 4 hours, which was faster than usual, and which meant Rook had prioritized it, which meant Rook had inferred something from the request that Cillian had not explicitly communicated. He read it at 6 in the evening, at his desk, with the specific attention he gave to files that were not operationally critical and therefore could be read without the secondary monitoring of risk that accompanied files that were Nini Osei, 31 years old, born in Accra, Ghana, arrived in the United States at age 7 with her mother and 2 brothers. Mother was a registered nurse who currently worked at Rush University Medical Center. One brother was an engineer in Houston. One brother was a sous chef in a restaurant in Evanston. Nini herself had studied 2 years of culinary arts at a community college before leaving the program. Records did not indicate why. Had begun working at the Diversi diner 6 years ago. She had worked there since without interruption, which was notable in a service industry where turnover was structurally high and where staying 6 years at a single location was the kind of consistency that spoke to something specific, either the person or the place or some combination. No criminal record. No debt beyond a modest student loan in its final year of repayment. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, 6 blocks from the diner, which was either convenient or deliberate, and was probably both. She had a social media presence that was minimal, and resent an account she had started 2 years ago and used primarily to share photographs of food she had made or eaten, with occasional observations about things she had read. The observations were specific and dry and occasionally funny. Rook had included 3 screenshots without being asked, which was another thing Rook did not normally do. Cillian read the 3 screenshots. One was a photograph of a bowl of something with the caption "Times made this with 4 ingredients. Cost less than $8. Took 20 minutes. I will not be sharing the recipe because I need advantages in this economy." One was a photograph of a book, spine. The title was not visible, with the caption, 300 pages in, and the author has not yet addressed the most obvious question. I am starting to think the most obvious question is the point. One was a photograph of a spilled coffee cup on a counter with the caption times not mine, not my problem. And yet, at the bottom of the file, Rook had added a note in his characteristic flat format times. Subject is known in the Logan Square area as a reliable and well-regarded figure in the neighborhood community. Has organized 2 food-sharing events in the past 18 months through the diner, informally, without institutional backing, regarded positively by local residents across demographic groups, no connection to any persons or operations in our known network. And then, below that times, one additional note. The subject was observed during a brief conversation with a colleague, approximately 1 hour after your visit to the diner on Tuesday morning. The colleague asked the subject if she recognized the customer who had experienced a payment shortfall. The subject confirmed that she had recognized the customer. The colleague asked if she intended to mention it to anyone. The subject said, quote, "Why would I?" Unquote. End of observed conversation. Cillian read this last paragraph 3 times. He set the file down. He sat at his desk for a long time. The thing about the test was that it worked. This was not an assumption. Cillian had data. 15 years of running versions of the same test, across perhaps 40 people in situations where the result had mattered to a decision he was making, and the results had been consistent in the way that reliable tests were consistent. They had told him what people were going to do before he had committed to a situation in which that information was necessary. The test had prevented at least 2 significant professional disasters that he was aware of, and had probably prevented others he was not aware of, because he had acted on the results before the alternative scenarios had time to develop. The test worked because the fundamental insight behind it was correct. People changed their behavior based on perceived status. Not all people, in every instance, but enough people, often enough, that the observation was operationally useful. A person who treated you differently when they thought you had money than when they thought you did not had told you something important about the load-bearing structure of their character. The load-bearing structure was what mattered. The surface was irrelevant. Nini Osei had not changed her behavior. This was not, by itself, unusual. Occasionally, people didn't change their behavior because they genuinely didn't register status as a variable in how they engaged with strangers. These people existed. Cillian had encountered perhaps 6 of them in 15 years, and in each case, he had verified the result by running the test from the other direction, appearing as himself, clearly, and observing whether the behavior changed in the upward direction. If it didn't change in either direction, the person was genuinely indifferent to status as a social signal, which was its own kind of rarity and its own kind of information. He had not run the test from the other direction with Nini Osei. He did not need to, because Nini Osei had not failed to notice his status. She had noticed it and said nothing, which was a different category of response entirely. The category was, she knew, and she acted as though she didn't know. And the reason she acted as though she didn't know was that she had decided it was not relevant to how she was going to treat him. This was not indifference. Indifference would have been easier to categorize. This was a decision considered deliberate, arrived at, in real time, to treat the information as not information, to receive it and set it aside, and continue doing her job in the way that she had decided to do her job, which was the same for everyone who sat at the tables in her section, regardless of who they were outside of them. Cillian looked at the file on his desk. He thought about the specific sequence of events on Tuesday morning, the assessment in her eyes when she first looked at him, which had been the assessment of a person who already knew and was completing a formality. The coffee poured to the correct level. The order taken without comment. The food brought at 22 minutes, with the eggs at 12 and the toast at 6. The refill at 30 minutes. And then the check. And the 2-second look. And times, don't worry about it. And the 20 put in the drawer. and the turn to the next table. He thought about what that sequence required. Not generosity, or not primarily. Primarily it required a decision made in advance, a rule of some kind. A principle about how she was going to treat people. Arrived at before Tuesday morning, and applied on Tuesday morning without renegotiation. The decision had already been made. She had simply been executing it. He found this considerably more interesting than generosity would have been. He went back on Thursday. Not for the reasons he had originally gone on Tuesday. The Fenwick situation had been resolved through other means. Quickly, and without the need for further visits to the diner. He went back because he had read the file, and sat with it for 2 days, and had arrived at the conclusion that he needed more information. Which was a conclusion he had reached before, but which this time was accompanied by an unusual secondary awareness. He was not sure what additional information would satisfy it. He arrived at 8:45, which was later than Tuesday, and which meant the breakfast rush was past its peak, and the diner was in the intermediate state between busy and quiet that tended to occur mid-morning. He sat in the same booth. He ordered coffee and eggs, which was the same order, and did not perform any shortage of funds, because there was nothing left to test, and he had known that before he sat down. Nini came to his booth with the coffee pot at the same time she would have come on Tuesday, with the same motion, and looked at him with the expression she had used on Tuesday, which was the assessment of a person completing a formality, and said times, "You came back." It was not a question. It was an observation, delivered in the flat register of someone noting a fact. "I did," he said. She poured the coffee. Same order. Same order. She wrote it on the notepad and went to the kitchen pass-through and came back to refill the cup of the man at the counter, and then went to another table, and he watched her work for the next several minutes, with the attention he gave things he was trying to understand. At some point, in the interval between his order arriving and his finishing it, he became aware that he had stopped thinking about the test and about the file and about the question of what additional information would satisfy the conclusion he had reached 2 days ago, and was instead simply sitting in a booth in a diner in Logan Square, eating correctly scrambled eggs and drinking good coffee and not thinking about anything in particular, which was a state he did not remember last being in. He sat in it for a while. When he left the correct amount, plus a reasonable tip, not the $20 shortfall of Tuesday, not an outsized amount, just the amount that a person left when they had had a good experience and wanted to indicate that without making a statement about it. He walked to his car and sat in it for a moment and thought about not thinking about anything in particular, which had been an unusual experience and which he found he wanted more of, which was itself an unusual conclusion. He drove toward the city. He thought about a woman who had decided in advance how to treat people and had been executing that decision on Tuesday morning without renegotiation, and who had noted his return on Thursday with the flat accuracy of a person who noticed things and did not require them to mean more than they meant. He thought about the 3 screenshots Rook had included without being asked. He thought about times not mine, not my problem, and yet. He drove the rest of the way to his office without reaching any conclusions he was prepared to act on, which was a new experience for a man who had been acting on conclusions for 20 years, and which he filed under things requiring more mornings in the same booth before the information was sufficient. He called Rook when he arrived at his desk. "The Fenwick situation," he said. "Status. Resolved." Rook said, "As of yesterday." "Good." A pause. "I'll be in Logan Square on Tuesday mornings for the next few weeks. Schedule around it." A pause on Rook's end that was longer than the pause Rook normally used. "Understood," Rook said, in the tone he used when he had drawn a conclusion he was not going to state. "That's all," Cillian said, and ended the call. He came back on Tuesday, as he had told Rook he would, and then on Thursday of that same week, because Tuesday had not produced enough of the not thinking about anything in particular that he had found on the first Thursday, and then on the following Tuesday, and by the third week he had established a pattern that Rook had stopped scheduling around and had simply begun accounting for as a fixed element of the Tuesday and Thursday mornings. On the fifth visit, Nini brought the coffee without being asked, which she had been doing since the second visit, and set it at his left hand rather than his right, which was where he preferred it and which he had not told her. On the sixth visit, she sat down, not in the way that suggested she was doing something she had decided to do, in the way of a person who had a 7-minute break between the morning rush and the transition to the mid-morning configuration of the room, and who had, in the course of her standard movement through the diner, arrived at the end of the counter nearest his booth and had apparently determined that sitting in the booth was a reasonable use of the 7 minutes. She sat in the seat across from him with a cup of coffee of her own and looked out the window at Diversey and said nothing for approximately 45 seconds. Then she said, without looking at him, "You're not from here originally." He looked at her. "Logan Square, Chicago." "No." He picked up his cup. "Ireland. Originally, County Clare. I came here at 12. She nodded. She looked at the street. "My mother says Accra is louder than Chicago, but I think she's misremembering." "What do you think it is?" She looked at the street. "I think Chicago is loud in a different direction. Accra is loud upward. Chicago is loud sideways." A pause. "I've been back twice. As an adult. The second time I understood what she meant." He looked at the window. At the street, doing what Diversey did at 10 in the morning, which was the specific mid-morning traffic of a neighborhood that contained a significant number of people who worked from home and who treated the diner as a third location between home and wherever they went when they needed a third location. He had observed this over 5 previous visits and had developed a passing familiarity with the recurring faces. "Did you always want to work here?" he said, "in the diner?" She looked at him, not the assessment expression, or not only that. "No," she said. "I wanted to be a chef. I was in culinary school." She looked back at the window. Things changed. He did not ask what things. She had said it in the tone that people used when they were providing information about a direction that had changed rather than inviting a discussion of the change, and he recognized the tone because he used it himself. "Do you cook?" she said. "I manage a logistics operation," he said, which was one of the true things he said when he said things that were true without being complete. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. She was still looking at the window. "Not often," he said. "I know how to. I learned young." "From who?" "A man who was in a particular situation I was also in, for a brief period when I was 15. He had been a cook before the situation and he was bored, and I was available." She looked at him at this. The expression was the reading expression, the one she used when she was updating her information. "What did he teach you?" Risotto," Cillian said, "and how to break down a chicken, and the correct way to season a cast-iron pan, which I was told repeatedly was more important than the risotto." The corner of her mouth moved. It was a small movement, and it was in the direction of something that was not quite a smile, and was in the vicinity of one. And it happened, and was gone before he had time to decide what to do with it. "He wasn't wrong," she said. Her break ended. She stood up, picked up her cup, looked at him once. "Same order Tuesday," she said. "Same order," he said. She went back to the counter. The diner continued around her. Cillian sat in the booth with his coffee and thought about a man in a facility in County Clare who had been a cook and had been bored and who had spent 6 weeks teaching a 15-year-old how to make risotto, and thought about the fact that he had not thought about that man in approximately 15 years, and thought about the specific quality of a conversation that could surface a memory that thoroughly buried without appearing to try. On the 7th visit, the second Tuesday of the 3rd week, he arrived to find the diner in a different configuration than usual. 2 of the regular mid-morning tables were occupied by what appeared to be a group of approximately 8 people, ranging in age from perhaps 20 to approximately 70, who had brought bags and had spread papers and laptops across two pushed-together tables, and who were engaged in a discussion that involved a large piece of paper with a diagram on it that Cillian could not read from his booth, but which had the shape of a floor plan of some kind. He sat in his booth. Nini brought coffee. He nodded toward the group. "What's that?" "Neighborhood Council Subcommittee," she said. "They meet here when they can't get the library room." She looked at the group with the expression she used when she was looking at something she was familiar with and had opinions about. "They're planning the winter food share event." "You organized that," he said. She looked at him. It was a faster look than usual. "A recalibration. The file your person made," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. 2 years ago," she said, "we had 3 families in the building next door who were having a specific kind of bad winter. I had extra. The diner had extra. It became a thing." She refilled his coffee. "I don't run it anymore." "They do." She nodded at the group. "That's better." He watched the group for a moment. One of the people, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, was drawing something additional on the large paper while someone else talked. The drawing looked like it might be a map of collection points. "Why did you stop organizing it?" he said. Nini looked at the group. "Because the point was for them to be able to do it without me," she said. "If I stay in the middle, it becomes about me staying in the middle." She turned back to the counter. "Same order. Eggs will be about 15 minutes. The morning cook is behind." She went back to the counter. Cillian sat in the booth and looked at the Neighborhood Council Subcommittee and thought about what she had said, which was the kind of thing that sounded simple and was not simple, which was the kind of thing he had been noticing in the things she said since the 3rd visit and which he had been accumulating, without a clear sense of what the accumulation was for. After the 7th visit, he went to his office and sat at his desk and did something he had not done in some time. He tried to identify what he was doing. He was going to a diner twice a week. He was eating eggs and drinking coffee and having conversations with a woman who had decided in advance how to treat people and was executing that decision consistently, and who had a 7-minute break on most mornings, during which she sometimes sat in the booth across from him and said things he found himself thinking about for the rest of the day. He was scheduling his Tuesday and Thursday mornings around this. He had told Rook to schedule around it. He had not missed a visit in 3 weeks. He tried to identify what this was in the vocabulary he usually applied to situations he was in, which was the vocabulary of purposes and outcomes, and the specific ROI calculus of a person who had spent 20 years treating every allocation of time and attention as a resource allocation question. The vocabulary did not fit. It did not fit in the way that the vocabulary of one domain often failed to apply to another domain, which was information. The information was that he was not here because of a purpose he could state. He was here because the not thinking about anything in particular was something his system had apparently needed for a long time and had not had and had now found. And because the woman who made it possible was interesting in a way that was not the way he was used to finding people interesting, which was as variables with predictable behavior patterns. She was interesting in the way of a thing he had not yet understood and wanted to. He sat with this assessment and found it accurate, and also found it insufficient. And the insufficiency was itself information, which was that the situation had moved beyond the category of interesting into a category he did not have a pre-existing label for. He thought about the corner of her mouth on the 6th visit, in the direction of something that was not quite a smile and was in the vicinity of one. He thought about times the point was for them to be able to do it without me. He thought about times not mine, not my problem, and yet times which had been about a spilled coffee cup, but which he had found himself applying, privately, to a number of situations in his life over the past 3 weeks, in a way that was productive and disorienting in approximately equal measure. He picked up his phone. He called Rook. "Clear Thursday afternoon," he said. "Done." Rook said, "Anything else?" "No." A pause. "Yes. I need a table at Monteverde for Thursday at 7. A longer pause than usual. "Monteverde," Rook said. "The restaurant." Yes. For Thursday. For Thursday. For 2. Rook said. Not a question. For 2, Cillian confirmed. He ended the call. He sat at his desk and thought about the 7th visit and the neighborhood council subcommittee and the diagram on the large paper and the woman who had organized a food-sharing event and then stepped back from it so that it could exist without her, and thought about whether Monteverde was the right choice, which it was noted was his choice, his comfort, his territory, and picked up his phone again. He sent a text to the number Rook had found for Nini Osei's personal phone, which he had not used before. It said, "Times I would like to take you to dinner. I'm told I should let you choose where." He set the phone down. He looked at the window. He had not told Rook he had her number. He had also not told Rook who the second seat at Monteverde would be for. Rook had drawn both conclusions without being told, which was what Rook was for, and had not stated them, which was also what Rook was for, and which Cillian found, in this particular moment, more useful than elaboration. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The text said, "Times. There's a place in Edgewater. Ethiopian. I've been going since I was 20. Friday works better for me than Thursday." He read it twice. He typed Times Friday. "What time?" "Tay." The response came in 30 seconds times 7. "I'll send you the address. Don't be late. They stop taking reservations at 8, and the injera is worth being on time for." He looked at the text for a moment. He typed Times, "I'll be on time." And then, before he put the phone down, he added Times, "Thank you," which was not something he typically added, and which was accurate, and which he sent before he could decide whether it was too much. The response came immediately, Times, "You're welcome. Same order Tuesday." He looked at this for a long moment. Then he typed Times, same order. He put the phone down. He looked at the window. Outside, the city was doing what it did, which was everything at once, without waiting for anyone to be ready. And Cillian sat at his desk in the specific state of a person who has made a decision they are not going to renegotiate, and who is finding that the state is more comfortable than expected. He picked up the logistics report that had been waiting on the corner of his desk since this morning and began to read it. And for the first time in a long time, he finished it in one sitting without thinking about anything else. Which was either because the report was unusually interesting or because something had been set down that had been taking up space for a while. And he suspected it was the second one. She sent the address on Thursday afternoon, with a second text that said, "Times. It's called Demera. Parking is bad on Friday nights, so take the train or come early enough to find street parking on Glenwood. And then, a minute later, Times, or use a car service, I suppose. That's probably more your situation." He read the second text and thought about what it indicated about what she had been thinking about in the interval between the first and second message, which was that she had written the first in the register of things she said to everyone, and had then remembered who she was talking to, and added the second. He liked this. He texted back, "Times, I'll take the blue line to red line," which was true. He had not taken the train in approximately 4 years, and had no particular reason not to start on Friday. She did not text back after that, which was consistent with everything he had observed about how she communicated. She said what needed to be said and then stopped. Demera was on Broadway in Andersonville, and Nini was already there when he arrived. She was at a table in the middle third of the room, visible from the entrance, but not the first thing you saw coming in. Private enough for conversation. Not so far back that the room felt like an afterthought. The correct table. She was reading something on her phone when she saw him and put it down, and she was wearing a dark green dress that was not the work clothes he had only ever seen her in, and her hair was different. And she looked at him when he sat down with the assessment expression, which she apparently used in all contexts. "Blue line to red line," she said. "Blue line to red line," he confirmed. The corner of her mouth did the thing it had done on the 6th visit, except this time it went further, into an actual smile, which was a different thing and which he was not prepared for, and which he filed as something he was going to need to encounter a few more times before he knew what to do with it. "You should order the Doro what?" she said, "if you've never had it. And the kitfo, if you eat beef. We're sharing a platter. All right? You're not alarmed by eating with your hands. I grew up eating with my hands. We just called it different things. What did you call it? Soda, bread, and whatever came with it. The occasions didn't involve injera." She laughed. It was short and real, and he knew the difference between the two. And she lasted only a moment before she picked up the menu. She clearly did not need. She had been here since she was 20 and looked at it, giving them both a moment after the laugh, which was a specific and considerate thing to do. They ate. The platter arrived. Injera spread wide. The stews arranged in portions, the colors of berbere and turmeric and ginger in the low light. And Nini showed him how to tear the injera correctly and which sauce went with what. And they ate and talked. And the talking was different from the diner talking in the way that the diner talking had been through a window, and this was not. She told him about culinary school, not what had changed. She did not tell him that, and he did not ask. But what she had loved about it, the chemistry of heat and acid and fat, interacting with protein and time, the way a thing tasted entirely different at one temperature than another. She described a class on emulsification, the way people described things that had genuinely changed how they saw something. He listened and asked questions about what she was saying rather than about the direction she had not gone, and she answered with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about these things for a long time and was glad to have someone to think them with. He told her about logistics, not the layers beneath it, not the structures his operation used or what moved through the supply chain that could not appear on official manifest, but the underlying problem, moving things through a world that put obstacles between where things were and where they needed to be, and the specific intellectual pleasure of finding paths through obstacles that were elegant rather than merely functional. She listened with the attention of someone who found things genuinely interesting and asked a question about redundancy in routing systems that was more precise than he expected, and that told him she had been doing something with what he said rather than waiting for her turn to talk. "How do you know about redundant routing times?" he said. "I ran a food bank distribution operation for 14 months. Volunteer. Before the diner. We had 3 distribution points and 2 volunteer drivers, and every week something fell through, and you learned very fast to build the backup before you needed it." "That's not in the file." "No." A pause. "I didn't use my name. I did it under the organization's name. I don't put my name on things I do with other people's effort." He sat with this. He thought about the food share event, the neighborhood council subcommittee, a 14-month volunteer operation whose distribution problem she had solved and then handed to the organization. He thought about a principle times. If I stay in the middle, it becomes about me staying in the middle, times being applied consistently across multiple contexts over multiple years without any apparent need for acknowledgement. "Why not times?" he said. She thought about this in the way she thought about things, which was actually, and without performance. Because the thing should be able to exist without me. If it can't, I've built something fragile. If it can, I've built something that works. She looked at him. The point isn't my name on it. The point is it working. He looked at her across the table in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, and she was apparently aware of this because she looked back and said times, "You're doing the thing you do." "What thing?" "The looking, like you're running a calculation." "I am," he said. And he picked up his coffee. They had moved to coffee at some point. He was not sure when. "I'm trying to understand how you arrived at that principle. Whether it was decision or formation. Meaning, was it something I decided or something I became?" "Yes." She looked at the table. "My mother," she said. After a moment, "She came here with nothing, and she built a life for 3 children in a country where she didn't know anyone. And she never put her name on it. She'd say she was just doing what needed doing." She looked up. "I used to think that was modesty." Now, I think it was accuracy. The thing that needed doing was the point. She was the method. He sat with this for a long time. The restaurant continued around them, conversations at other tables. The kitchen's ambient activity, and he sat across from Nini Osei and thought about a woman who had come to a country where she knew no one and had built a life for 3 children and had described herself as the method rather than the point. And what it meant that the daughter she had raised had arrived at the same principle independently and applied it across years of food banks and neighborhood events and diner sections where she poured coffee to the correct level and did not change her behavior based on who was sitting in the booth. She sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. Nini looked at him, reading expression, and something that was not only the reading expression. She is. She'd probably have opinions about you. Good or bad? Specific. She has specific opinions. He looked at her. You told her about me. Not a question. She looked at him with the not quite smile. I told her I was going to dinner with someone who took the blue line from downtown to not seem like he had a driver. She said that was either very considerate or very calculating, and she'd know which when she met you. And which does she think it is? Both. She thinks both things can be true. He looked at her for a long moment. What does she think about both things being true? She thinks it depends on which one is in front at a given moment. Nini looked at him steadily. I told her I wasn't sure yet. And now times, he said. She looked at the table and then at him. I'm less unsure, she said. He held her gaze. There was something happening that did not require naming, and that both of them appeared to understand did not require naming the specific quality of a thing arriving at its own pace and not needing to be pushed into language before it was ready. I'm glad you told her, he said. That you told someone. Why? Because it means you weren't treating this as something that didn't count. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I wasn't. They left at 10:15, 3 hours after they had arrived, and stood on Broadway in the October dark. And Nini looked at the street and then at him. I'm taking the red line north. I'm taking it south. Then this is where we stop. Practical. The way she said most things. Then she looked at him with the expression that was multiple things at once. And she said times. Same order Tuesday. He thought about 3 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and eggs at 12 o'clock, and toast at 6, and a coffee cup refilled at the left hand. He thought about times. Don't worry about it, Times said without performance. He thought about the corner of her mouth on the 6th visit, and then the full smile across the injera platter, and then this, the October street. And the expression that was the reading expression, and not only the reading expression. Same order Tuesday, he said, and Friday. She looked at him. Friday's not a diner day. No, I meant dinner. The not quite smile became the actual smile, briefly, and then she turned and walked toward the Bryn Mawr station, and he stood on Broadway and watched her go, and did not move until she had turned the corner. He walked to the Berwyn station and went down the stairs and waited for the southbound train, and stood on the platform and thought about times. I'm less unsure, which was the most accurate thing he had heard anyone say in a long time, because it was exactly accurate and not more than that, and exactly accurate was more than enough. The train came. He took it south. He thought about Tuesday and about Friday and about times, same order, which he was going to be on time for. Not formally, there was no explicit agreement. No moment when either of them said, Friday dinner is what we are doing now. It was simply that the first Friday happened, at a Peruvian place in Pilsen that Nini had chosen because the ceviche was the best she had found in the city, and she had been wanting to bring someone there for 2 years, but had not had someone she wanted to bring until now. And the second Friday happened, at a Japanese spot in Ravenswood that Cillian chose because she had told him it was his turn, and he had spent 3 days thinking about it before remembering a place he had been once for business and had wanted to return to for reasons that had nothing to do with business. And the third Friday happened at a Vietnamese restaurant in Uptown that neither of them had been to before, and that turned out to have pho that Nini declared to be the best she had found in 5 years of looking, which was a significant claim, and which she made with the flat certainty of a person who had been eating seriously for a long time and knew the difference. By the third Friday, the pattern had the quality of a pattern rather than a sequence, which was a different quality. And neither of them mentioned the difference because mentioning it was not necessary. The Tuesday and Thursday mornings continued. He ordered the same order. She brought the coffee without being asked. On some mornings she sat across from him during her 7-minute break, and on some mornings she did not. And the mornings when she did not were not worse than the mornings when she did. They were what they were. Which was a morning in a booth with correctly scrambled eggs and good coffee, and a woman moving through the room with the economy of motion that came from doing a thing well for long enough that the doing became the thing itself. Rook had stopped commenting on the schedule. He had also, at some point that Cillian had not identified precisely, stopped scheduling anything on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before 10 and on Friday evenings before 8, which was either Rook making an inference and acting on it, or Rook receiving an instruction Cillian did not remember giving. Cillian did not examine this. The accommodation existed and was useful, and that was sufficient. On a Tuesday morning in the fourth weaker morning when the diner was quieter than usual because the weather was the specific grey Chicago weather of November that discouraged people from going outside unless they had reason, Cillian arrived to find his booth occupied. The occupant was a woman in her 60s with close-cropped grey hair and reading glasses that were currently pushed up on her forehead, sitting with a cup of coffee and a newspaper folded to the crossword. And she was looking at him when he came through the door with the expression of a person who had been expecting someone and had arrived first, intentionally. He looked at the booth. He looked at the woman. He looked at the counter, where Nini was making coffee and not looking at him, which was a deliberate not looking. He sat down across from the woman. She looked at him over the top of the crossword. "You're on time," she said. "Good." "You're Nini's mother," he said. "Yes." She set the crossword down. "Abena." She looked at him with the assessment expression, which explained where Nini had gotten it, and it was slightly more intense than Nini's version, with an additional quality that Cillian identified as the assessment of a mother rather than the assessment of a person, which was a narrower and more specific instrument. "She didn't tell you I would be here." "No." "She told you about me." "She did." Abena looked at him. She said, "You take the blue line." "When I'm coming here." "Yes." Abena looked at the counter, where Nini was still making coffee and still not looking at them with the very specific quality of someone not looking at something on purpose, and then back at Cillian. "My daughter," she said, "does not introduce people to me. She has not done this in several years. The last time, the person was not worth the introduction. She didn't introduce them on purpose. I happened to be at the same event." A pause. "This time she left me a note that you come here Tuesday mornings and she thought I might want to get a coffee." He looked at her. "A note?" "A note. She didn't ask me directly because she knew I would say yes, and she didn't want it to feel like permission." Abena picked up her coffee cup. "She's like her father in that way. He used to arrange things and then pretend they arranged themselves." "Is that what she did?" he said. "She arranged for me to meet you," Abena said, "and left it informal enough that you could both pretend it was accidental if it went badly." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "It is not going badly." He looked at her. He thought about the note, left on purpose. The informal arrangement. The specific engineering of a meeting that left room for it to not be a meeting if the meeting did not work. He thought about times if I stay in the middle it becomes about me staying in the middle. He thought about the method rather than the point. "She's arranged things to be able to exist without her," he said. Abena looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not surprise. Something more specific than that. The expression of a person hearing something that confirms an assessment. "Yes," she said. "She has." A pause. "She learned it from watching me. I think." although she'd say she arrived at it herself, which is also true. She set the cup down. What did she tell you about me? That you came here with nothing and built a life for 3 children and described yourself as the method rather than the point. Abena was quiet for a moment. She remembered that. She applies it, he said. Abena looked at him with the mother assessment expression, which was the narrower and more specific instrument, and he sat with being looked at by it without adjusting his posture or his expression, which was the thing he had learned to do in rooms where the assessment mattered. She said, "You're calculating and considerate simultaneously." Abena said. She said she wasn't sure which was in front. "I'm less sure than I used to be," he said. "About most things." Abena looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the crossword. 23 down. She said, 7 letters. Prepared to begin. He looked at the crossword. He thought about 7 letters. Ready, he said. She wrote it in. She looked at it. She looked at him. Sit with me until she has her break, she said. She'll pretend it happened naturally. He sat. The diner continued around them. After approximately 4 minutes, Nini appeared at the end of the counter with her coffee and looked at the booth and produced the expression of someone encountering a situation that had developed differently than planned and who was deciding how to receive it. And then she came over and sat down next to her mother and across from Cillian and said, with the flat accuracy she brought to most things, "I see you two found each other." "You left a note," her mother said. "I left a note," Nini confirmed. She looked at Cillian. She would have come anyway eventually. I thought it was better to have some control over the timing. "Some," Abena said, in the tone of a woman who had observed the architecture of what her daughter had done and found it transparent and effective, and was not going to say so explicitly. Cillian looked at Nini across the table. She looked back at him with the assessment expression and the not only assessment expression simultaneously, which was the combination he had come to know and which told him she was doing the real-time updating that she did when something was happening that she was paying full attention to. "How did it go?" she said. 23 down, he said. 7 letters. She looked at her mother. Her mother was drinking her coffee and not looking at either of them with the expression of a woman who had done what she came to do and was now minding her own business. "Ready," Nini said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Not about the crossword." She looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved, and this time it went all the way, and it stayed there longer than it had before, which was long enough for him to decide what he was going to do with it, which was look back at her without looking away. Afterwards, after Abena had finished her coffee and her crossword and had said goodbye to Cillian with the handshake of a woman who shook hands with the grip of someone who meant it, and after Nini's break had ended and she had gone back to the counter and the morning had continued in its morning, Cillian sat in the booth for an additional few minutes and thought about the last several weeks. He thought about a Tuesday morning in October when he had sat in this booth with a $20 bill and a plan, and the specific quality of the 2-second look he had received instead of what he had been expecting. He thought about a background check and 3 screenshots that Rook had included without being asked. He thought about a 6th visit and a 7-minute break and a conversation about Accra versus Chicago that had surfaced a memory he had not accessed in 15 years. He thought about an injera platter, and times I'm less unsure. He thought about Tuesday mornings and Thursday mornings and Friday evenings, and a woman who moved through a room without friction and poured coffee to the correct level and had organized a food bank for 14 months and had decided, in advance, how to treat people, and had been executing that decision consistently since before he had ever walked through the door. He thought about the test he had run for 15 years, and about all the results he had collected, and about the specific result on the first Tuesday that had not fit into any of the categories he had built for containing results, and about what it had taken him 5 visits to understand, which was that the result had not fit because he had been running the wrong test. He had been running a test that asked, what does this person do when they think circumstances are other than they appear? The question the result had actually answered was different. What does this person do when they have decided in advance who they are going to be, regardless of circumstances? The answer to the second question was exactly this. Exactly, and only this. The same for everyone who sat at the tables in her section. The same on a Tuesday morning in October, and on every Tuesday morning before it, and presumably on every Tuesday morning after it. He had spent 15 years trying to find out what people were like when they weren't performing. What he had found, in a diner in Logan Square, was a person who had made a decision so thoroughly that the performance and the person were no longer distinguishable. There was no gap between them. The test could not find a gap because there was none to find. He picked up his coffee. It was still at the correct temperature. He looked at the counter where Nini was explaining something to the man on the stool at the far end, her hands moving in the specific way they moved when she was describing something she found interesting. And he thought about Friday, which was 3 days away, and which he was already thinking about. And he thought about the specific distance between times. "Don't worry about it," Times said on the first Tuesday, and "Times I'm less unsure," Times said 3 weeks later, which was a distance that had been traveled in both directions, and which he found, sitting in the booth in November with good coffee at the correct temperature, to be exactly the right distance, not too fast and not held in place, moving at the pace of 2 people who were each paying attention to what was actually there. He left at 10 past 10. He left the correct amount, plus a reasonable tip. He put on his coat. He walked past the counter on his way to the door, and Nini was there, and she looked at him as he passed, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. And he went out into the November morning, and the city received him back into itself, as it always did, without ceremony, without waiting, and he walked 2 blocks to where the car was, not because he had taken the train, which was something he was going to continue doing on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and now also on Fridays. And he walked to the Blue Line station and went down the stairs and stood on the platform and waited. And the platform was cold, and the city was grey, and the train came, and he got on it. And the distance between the diner and his office passed in the specific way that a distance passed when the place you were going from was somewhere you were glad to have been, and the place you were going to was somewhere you could manage until the next time. It was, he thought, on the train going south through the grey November morning, exactly enough, not adequate, enough, in the way that enough meant when it meant more than sufficient, when it meant the right amount of a thing that was the right thing. He thought about Friday. He was going to be on time,